Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. So, welcome to Shifting API Standards Left. I'm at Olson-Morgan, and just to start off with, tell you a little bit about myself. Began my career as an engineer, originally aerospace, did some computational fluid dynamics, then had to go off and find a real job for a little while, and ended up as a management consultant, went through a whole bunch of different businesses, did some data science type things, and actually founded a couple of digital consulting practices within a couple of strategy consulting groups. A couple of years ago, decided I wanted to get back to technology, and so was lucky enough to be able to join Marsh McLennan as their core API and innovation leads. When I'm not working and coding, I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old, so that's what I spend my time doing, is helping them figure out how to navigate the world. The last presentation before me was Twitter, who needed almost no introduction. Marsh McLennan may not be familiar to some of you, so celebrated 150th anniversary as a company this year. It's a Fortune 500 professional services firm, insurance and reinsurance broking, human resources and benefits consulting, and some management consulting. And it's a company that's been brought together over time by acquisition. This will become relevant as we get into the meat of this conversation. And right now it's 4 main operating companies, Marsh, Mercer, Guy Carpenter, and Oliver Wyman. And the central technology capability that myself and my colleague Suzanne here are part of was established in 2020 to accelerate and standardize the adoption of technology throughout the business. A lot of that technology acceleration is all about reuse, and something that I like to call the reuse taxonomy. So there are a number of ways that, as a developer, you can reuse code that other people have written, all the way from grabbing a code snippet off Stack Overflow, the whole way through to using an API where you may not be touching any of the code they've actually written, you're solely consuming the REST service. The further you go to the right, it gets increasingly efficient to reuse and maintain. On the further on the left, you get more developer flexibility. Stack Overflow code snippet, you can grab it, change it, use it, discard it. APIs, you're within the paradigm of the API, which means from an API developer perspective, you've got to do a better job. Marsh McLennan has a kind of interesting software challenge, and that's because we build software for ourselves that we use to run our own business. We build it for our clients and to support our various professional services. In some cases, that's actually for our clients' employees. We may help them administer, say, insurance products that they buy in their own capacity, or pension services and other things. And in some cases, our clients' clients. And what I mean by that is we do some of the insurance broking for people who, for example, run a delivery business for Amazon. So you've sort of got a B2B to SMB, as well as a B2B to C, B2B. I think we do everything except actual direct B2C. And what that means is sort of, again, I'll draw the analogy with Twitter here. Twitter has one product with a number of API endpoints and resources and a massive amount of volume hitting against all of those. What we have is a massively disparate estate of software applications trying to solve different problems in our different business lines, and in some cases do so in ways that are different for different clients who are consuming it. When you go underneath the hood and actually build the engineering piece, what we want to do is try and reuse common solutions everywhere that we can. So that's what led us to API standards. And so the core benefit for us in particular around API standards is how do you reduce developer friction? How do you make it as easy as possible for developers to pick up an API and use it in their application space? And especially sort of given the disparate origins of where our business pieces have come from, what we wanted to do was make APIs feel like they come from one platform. It doesn't hurt to try and sort of bring everybody along a journey around logging, around security, around other aspects of sort of the API journey, but really what we were focused on when we thought about API standards was developer friction. So first we started off by writing standards. And given that we've sort of been on this reuse journey and reuse gospel, we tried not to reinvent the wheel. Wherever possible, use the RFCs, look for cases where smarter people than us had thought for longer about the problem and use their answers and bring that into our work. and then review existing API standards within our business and outside. And as you saw from the guys from Azure this morning, the Microsoft API standards were one of the ones that we referenced and brought into the work that we've done. And one of the things that we found, and sort of prior to moving into APIs, I was doing quite a lot of work around sort of security and compliances. There's no ISO 27001 for API standards. There's no sort of SOC 2. And that's probably good in some ways, but the thing that I really felt that we were missing was actually, what are the questions that we need to answer? There's no sort of chapter 1 through chapter 10. And so what we found looking across lots of different standards documents is even where we might not have adopted a standard, or even where different standard documents disagreed, just the fact that they agreed on which questions needed to be answered was really valuable for us. We also learned that setting standards for a global organization took a fair bit of work. Put in context, Marsh McLennan is about 80,000 professionals globally, about 8,000 of those work in technology in somewhere probably around 100 countries. And so that involved office hours and focus groups that included everyone. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this is, I'm based out here, I'm Sacramento, California, is at some point if you're going to develop standards and if you're going to bring people together around APIs, you have to get on the phone and get on Zoom at some pretty weird times. And you don't have to do it that often, but it's really important if you're going to make that work to actually be able to engage with everybody in every time zone that your company is operating in so that everybody feels included. And then you can do things asynchronously as well, share feedback, etc. The second thing we learned was the first draft of this began in a Word document. That got out of hand pretty quickly. Then I moved it into Markdown and started at least keeping it in version control so I could track what was going on. And after a while, that started to get out of hand. So sort of put the software engineer hat back on, and we moved it into JSON. So what we actually started thinking about was, well, what's the structure of our API standards? And let's actually put that out as a nested object. We came up with some concepts, statuses, how close is it to release, rule sets, should this apply to the whole business or just potentially certain parts. And then what that allowed us to do was start segmenting each of the individual pieces of the standards down. And so they became individual markdown, sort of nested folder structure to keep it all sorted. And that meant, for example, if we wanted to reorganize the document, it was something that we could do and sort of make everything come together. And around this, we then ended up wrapping a little standards builder that just brought it all together in one file, put in version numbers and timestamps and numbered headings and all of that good stuff. And so we launched this back in September 2021, and if I'm going to be honest, it landed with a little bit of a whimper. And I think the biggest problem was length. So we had a lot of focus groups. Some of us, mostly me, got very into detailing out sort of the nuances of different ways to solve API standards and API challenges. And that document, when you actually print it to PDF, was about 46 pages. In contrast, our InfoSec team came out with a new information security policy, and their headline information security policy was 29. They hived about 400 pages off into other documents, but the point is you could engage with it in that shorter piece. So we then sort of said, well, we've got to make it shorter. So we said, well, let's go from 46 pages to 1. Pulled out sort of the key points from our API standards, put in hyperlinks that linked back to the actual document itself, but it still really didn't get the ball rolling in terms of standards adoption. So what we realized was, and back to the title of the talk, we had to start shifting everything left. We couldn't wait for people to either conduct an API reviews. We had to get engagement early on. And we were lucky that we had sort of decent patches of OpenAPI spec throughout the organization. I think most of our organization, and frankly, saw OpenAPI spec as a tool for documentation, a lot of Swagger UI, a lot of sort of redoc community. And so we said, well, we've got the OpenAPI specs, that gives us another point to be able to engage. And so we decided to migrate our standards into Alinta. Let's go the other way. So I'm sure you're all familiar with what Alinta is. I just grabbed the Wikipedia definition. And if you're working in the OpenAPI space, you're probably familiar with some of the products out there that are offering sort of linting. So most of them are here around this conference. You've got Swagger Hub has a linter built in. You've got Redocly offers an OpenAPI spec linter. I think Postman has one coming now. But where we actually landed, and sort of Microsoft kind of stole the thunder earlier, is we landed on Spectral, so Stoplight Studio's tool. And the main reason for that was twofold. One is that it's very self-contained, so we could inject it into lots of different process points. It's a self-contained executable. You can throw it into a CI process just as easily as you can put it on somebody's desktop, just as easily as you can use it elsewhere. And it had really solid support for custom rule sets, and being able to maintain and store those in files that, we could put into version control. And so, sort of examples of some of the things you get, we could define, we want all of our headers to be in hyphenated Pascal case. How do you go and check that in OpenAPI spec, and then all of the different rules and casings and everything else you can check for. And so we started pulling these rules together, and one of the things we ran into almost immediately was actually writing rules in JSON path and going down all the possibilities in OpenAPI spec to lint it is non-trivial, and that's partially because of the flexibility and power of the specification. There's not one way to do things. There's in some cases 3 or 4. It's being done in a way often that promotes reuse and modularity, so you have to be able to chase and find the pieces that you're looking for. And so what we realized fairly early on is, if we're actually going to do this, if we're going to try and move our standards into linting rules, we need to be able to test them. And that's where things got a little tricky. So once you get into testing linter rules, at that point, you're really pretty heavily embedded into the product that you're using. So luckily, Stoplight has a great Discord community. We sort of reached out. They shared a lot of what they were doing, which are internal tools that sit inside their open source repositories. Shout out to a gentleman called Jamie Tanner in the UK, who had actually sort of started probably on that discussion a few weeks before we had, and wrapped some of the Stoplight tools into Jest to make it some more easy to engage with. And the big surprise for us is, once we started testing, we realized that actually a lot of our rules didn't work in every case. And even some of the ones where we'd agreed with other standards and borrowed Spectral rule sets from other places didn't actually work. And even once we'd started building out tests and we're starting to put everything around that, we quickly got to the point where there was a lot of duplication and a lot of boilerplate around everything that we were doing. So if you go back to that first standards repository I had, if you imagine the Markdown document, one small paragraph of Markdown ended up with pages and pages of JavaScript and TypeScript all pushed into a folder just to actually cover the rules that we were going for. And so we took another step back, myself and some of the other engineers on the team, and said, let's actually start thinking about standards themselves as a framework. And so we'd sort of gone from that one document, we split it out into different sections, and we now said, well, what else can we put alongside that? And so we said, obviously, there's always going to be documentation, there's going to be words, so let's be able to link to Markdown. We've got rules that we're going to use. In this case, the rules are written in effectively in Spectral. And then we're actually going to author standard test cases. So given, unit tests effectively for each of the rules that we can then use to test the rules as we go through. This particular implementation, it's built in TypeScript. We use NX as our build framework, so we've actually structured it as libraries within that. And so what we're doing is we're parsing that YAML document, building test cases as we go in Jest, evaluate all of those, and assuming that our test cases pass, then we actually move through and render a linter rules file that has all the successful linter rules that are doing what we want them to do. And then, assuming that all that's working, then we actually render the text standards into a single Markdown document so that we've got a single piece as we move through versions. So where did that get us to? So we've got API standards that can be easily read. If you like reading 46 pages, that might just be me. You can glance over them in a single page on Signer. You can use them at design time through linters and the plugins, or you can embed that same linter component and tools into CI/CD stages. In our case, we've done that in GitHub, which is our next generation pipeline there using GitHub Actions. And because of the modularity of a component like Spectral, we've been able to make that available for use in legacy pipelines as well. And what we're seeing coming out of this is really significant improvements in standardization, naming conventions, common head. Just as we're seeing more new APIs be developed, they're converging on that standard that we want them to move towards. There's still some work to come there, and I'll sort of talk about one piece on this before I move on to the right-hand side, which is to the point that was made, again, the Microsoft talk had some statistics around it, but it sort of jibes well with my intuition, which is about 2/3 of the things around API design you can lint for, and about 1/3 you can't. I think that's the same challenge that we're starting to run into, is actually how, it's one thing to actually be able to lay out how do you structure an API so it looks similar. It's harder, I think, without working directly with some of those teams and some of the training components to get people to think about things in a resource-focused way. And so I'd actually be very interested if people ever had ways that they could sort of, check for things like Richardson maturity and in code. So what are we still working on? One of the big lessons we've had is, I think we found our developers split into two groups. And one of them has been, great, I've got API standards, I've got the way I like to develop, I've got my languages and tool sets. We support basically 3 main languages, Java, .NET, and JavaScript, TypeScript. So 4, but 3.5, across the work that we do. And some people are like, great, give me the standards, and I'll do my own implementations in compliance. I'll adapt some things maybe that I'm happy with already. And we've got other groups that basically, look, we actually don't want to have to figure out my own implementation. Please give me something to work with. Not do it for me, but at least point me in the right direction. And so one of the things we're looking to do is, how do we expand that sort of standards document we've got to include links to reference implementations, to include links to templates, and make it sort of a little bit filterable and searchable so that we can deal with the different languages we've got and the different types of implementations we've got. The second thing I'd really like to get rid of, and this is more just a sort of, I think, for the future health of a framework like this, is the dependency on something like Spectral. And that's no knock on Spectral. It's a great product, but I'd love to find a way that we can be a little bit more neutral in sort of the way that we're actually both building up rules. I think test cases will be easier, but actually, even if it's just being able to potentially switch out different rule sets for things like Swagger Hub or Redockley or other tools. And so sort of the question of, one more slide after this, but sort of the question that sort of I've been thinking about is, could there be a standard for API standards? And this is not trying to set out a universal API standard for everybody, but can we at least, is there an agreement of something of, the ISO 27001, the OWASP top 10, so something that when you set out to write your API standards for an organization, for a group, for a company, there is a template that you can start from, so at least we all know which questions we want to answer. And finally, a lot of thanks and acknowledgement. We borrowed from API standards, Microsoft, National Bank of Belgium, Adidas, Nordic APIs, API testing, I already mentioned Stoplight and Jamie Tanner, and then the massive pile of people that I worked with at Marsh McLennan to both actually put some of this technology together. So, Suzanne, Hugh, Kambui, Brian, and Arushi, and then an enormous group of people who actually both contributed to our standards and gave feedback. And so, it's the number of people it takes to actually put together even, what feels like a relatively small document at the end of the day. Any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. So the need to come up with a standard for a standard, is it because if you have a whole huge ecosystem of customers and you're trying to generate some standards, because I would imagine that different companies will have slightly different flavor of APIs. Is that what the driver saying, okay, company A, company B, company C, here's your standards that's generated based on
That's certainly part of it. I think the other thing is I'm sort of thinking about my own experience putting together standards and just probably the month or two in the summer of 2020, I just not even really knowing where to start. And how you could look at things that other people were doing, but there was a lot of sort of trying to effectively create a meta framework over the top of it. And I think that's something that probably a lot of people who are smarter than me on API standards and OpenAPI spec, which feels like this room and the attendant rooms, could give people when they're starting to really develop standards a really good place to start from.
Did you do this in the context of other ways to convey best practices or patterns you wanted people to follow? Reference architectures, reference implementations? Did you do anything else to try to target cats in the right direction?
This came first, and I think that's largely a function of some of the other technology evolution we had going on at the time. So we have a reference architecture in terms of how we're using Docker and Kubernetes, how we're using API gateways on top of that. But a lot of that technology 18 months ago was somewhat earlier stage. So I think what we're trying to start with was sort of the API standards around the spec to catch projects at an earlier stage. I think that lack of reference architecture is one of the things that we've sort of been pulled up on a little bit, and sort of been asked. That's got to be, I think, the next stage. If it's not just you have to use you have to use sort of OAuth flows and these sort of authentication mechanisms in these spaces, but actually, where should you implement those? In our cases, even getting down to like specific technology choices that we have as an enterprise. There are some things, there are a few things with Spectral that we've seen. Most of them are around really, really complex JSON path implementations. There are certainly some questions that I would like to interrogate an OpenAPI spec with that I either haven't found a JSON path expression that can do it, or I haven't found a JSON path expression that is reliably implementable to do it. As I understand it, the way that Spectral works is they actually use multiple JSON path interpreters under the hood. And there are certainly, I can't remember the precise example, but there are things where I've written what I think is valid JSON path. I can find some other interpreters who might interpret it, but the ones that are with the particular combination in Spectral doesn't always do it. I'm not a JSON path expert at all, but I've sort of seen that as I've worked with it.
So did you use out-of-the-box validation functions from Spectral, or you end up having your own custom?
We've used a combination of them. I think some of the examples I showed, we were doing more custom validations. Some of those we later replaced with out-of-the-box ones from Spectral over time. It's been less the actual validation functions. I think I was looking last night and we have maybe a handful of custom validation functions. It's really the complexity of the JSON path expression to go down and find the thing that I want to run the validator function against. It seems to be the biggest challenge.
Like a follow-up on the point of what makes it complex is that you've got a complex standard that you want to validate?
Yeah, basically. It's I think it's where we're starting to cross that line from linting. It's sort of the 2/3, 1/3. Is that there are times where I can conceptualize what I think should be a rule that reflects the standard, but it doesn't quite come out in the underlying structure. I don't know if that's, at some point it feels like if you can conceptualize it as an algorithm, it should be solvable, but that hasn't always proven to be the case. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.